Okay, we're back, and now Nigel is going to go over his books that he read in 2021.
Mm-hmm. The first book that I finished, I started reading it in 2020, was Let Us Dream, The Path to a Better Future by His Holiness the Pope. Between the two of us, I am more sympathetic to the papacy than Marian is, so I throw around terms like the Holy Father and Pontifex Maximus to comedic effect. But this is, he wrote this in the wake of the pandemic, just sort of, I guess, as a book of hope to, encouragement for everyone. And he talks about many things, about the importance of pets and cares for the future, things like that, just the things that uplift people. And I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was good. I think the only problems I had with it were just sort of vague things, nothing specific, just things that he says vaguely that could be interpreted badly. Of course, if there's one thing that happens to Pope Francis is that he's misquoted and deliberately misunderstood by people who don't like him.
People like me?
No, sometimes. Not to say that I'm a great fan of his or anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to read people's books that they wrote, right? Like, I mean, whether you like them or not, at least you're reading what they wrote.
And it's a specific book in that it serves a purpose. It's not so much about, say, repentance or about the liturgy or other important subjects. It's just about, we're having a pandemic now, and here are some things that we can do to improve life and help others, and so on, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And next was Howard's End by E.M. Forster. Let's see, I read A Room with a View some time ago, and I liked that, and I wanted to read more Forster, and I read Howard's End, and I really, really liked this book.
Now, did you watch the TV one first or after?
We watched the, what was it, 2018, I think, adaptation of it. Was it a BBC production?
Something like that, yeah.
One of those wonderful British things. And I liked that. And so I wanted to read the book, and I wanted to reread it the moment I finished it. I just liked it.
Really?
I'm not sure if you'd like it, though. But...
I've just not had a good track record with Forster, but I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
then the next one is Forster as well?
Oh yes, Where Angels Fear to Tread. This was his first novel, and I disliked it. I liked his writing style, which didn't seem to be fully developed yet, but the story itself, at least in specific parts, I really disliked. It's about this young British lady, sort of girl entering into womanhood. She goes to Italy, falls in love with some rake there. Who's just a loathsome character. Oh, you just want him horsewhipped. That's just awful. He murders his wife, not in the sense that he shot her, but he murdered his wife in
dear me.
In substance. And it was just...
Yikes.
There's one character whose name I just can't remember. Was it Philip? Oh dear. He's this lady's brother, and he just sort of goes on ramblings about sort of the family situation and how people act. He has a sister and a mother, and he goes to Italy to try to get the child back, because his sister that went to Italy, he has 2 sisters, the one that went to Italy had a child with the Italian fellow, and he's being sent there to try to get the child back. I don't know, the Italian fellow, I think his name's Gino. He has a lot of charisma, and Philip, I'll just call him Philip, at the risk of it being incorrect, he's aware of this, and he knows himself, and he's, pretty self-contained and aware, but he still, at least at one point, sort of gets caught up in his charisma and the charm of the area as well. And it was, I think my favorite parts was where he just sort of just rambles on in his thoughts about Italy and things like that.
So would you say it's... Now, I don't know which one was written first. This one or A Room with a View?
Oh, this was the first. Yeah.
So maybe A Room with a View is like the better version of the story.
Yeah, probably. Although the ingenue in that story falls in love with a lower class Englishman.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And the next is Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith. You got me this beautiful Folio Society edition of it as a gift, and it was just so beautiful. And, well, we came to this by Alfred Hitchcock's movie, Strangers on a Train, with Farley Granger and others. And, let's see, the book was... It was good. It's very different from the movie. It doesn't have that Hays Code, good guys winning ending.
We watched it again this year, didn't we?
Oh yeah, we did. You hosted a tea and we watched that movie.
Yeah.
It's sort of, you might think it's an odd choice, but in our family it sort of it works.
Well, we do like Alfred Hitchcock films, don't we?
So, yeah, and in the movie, the name of the nemesis is Bruno Antony. But in the movie, it's Charles Anthony Bruno. I don't know why they switched the name around. I don't know why they thought that would be a good idea, but they did.
Wait, what's it in the book?
In the book, it's Charles Anthony Bruno. And in the movie, it's Bruno Anthony.
I guess maybe they... So in the movie, do they refer to him as Bruno or Anthony?
Bruno.
Maybe because it's more distinct from the other name?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I remember learning about Hitchcock and how much of a micromanager he was in his movies. Like, there was this one scene where Bruno Antony, is reaching down in a sewer grate to get this all-important lighter that he's going to plant on a tourist island to serve the purpose of incriminating evidence against Guy Haynes. And in the shot, the camera is inside the sewer, and you can see Antony's hand reaching down, and you see an orange peel and some other litter. And Hitchcock chose the litter. That was, and he designed Antony's tie, which has lobsters on it, and it's supposed to mimic his pose when he's about to strangle someone. And so I just wonder why he chose that name. Maybe there was a book written about the subject that explains that. But anyway, yeah, and in the movie, Guy Haynes is an architect and not a tennis player. There's no lighter or MacGuffin like that. Just Charles Anthony Bruno. He's hounding Guy Haynes to murder his father because he murdered Miriam, Guy Haynes' wife. And in the book, Guy Haynes actually does commit the murder.
No, really?
Yeah.
That changes the whole story.
I know, it does.
Okay, well, don't say anymore.
Oh, no?
Well, I mean...
Oh, right, no, you didn't read the book. Oh, no, I can't tell. Oh, no, I said too much anyway.
No, it's alright. It's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
No, we'll move on.
Okay.
I think, I really like the movie, and I like the book. I think, actually, the book's ending might be better. The final 2 or 3 pages, I thought was a really good near twist.
I better read that then.
Next is the Fran Lebowitz reader. Fran Lebowitz is a comic writer in New York. She worked with Andy Warhol on his Interview magazine. That's where she got her first writing job, I think. Actually, that sort of ties in with something later, because right now I'm reading The Chiffon Trenches by the fashion journalist Andre Leon Talley. And he worked with Andy Warhol and Fran Lebowitz on his Interview magazine. But she wrote 2 books, 2 complete books. She's famous for her writer's block that lasts decades. One is Metropolitan Life and the other is Social Studies, and this is just those 2 books back to back. And it's just a series of comedic essays. It's a lot of snarkiness, lots of negative humor. I enjoyed it, but... But if you're not into that, then it's very acid. If you don't like that sort of thing, then it won't be for you.
Yeah, that's fair.
I remember you sent me an article about this Italian sculptor who sold for $10,000+ a nothing statue.
Oh.
It was 0 inches high, 0 inches deep, 0 inches wide.
Yes.
And I told you to check out on Overdrive the Fran Lebowitz reader and read the last essay, To Have and Do Not. No, yeah, To Have and Do Not, which is about someone she heard of who wrote a book or some books. And he sold the movie rights of a book he didn't write yet. And she says, I didn't realize how so much more profitable it is to not write than it is to write. And fun, too. So she told her agent that she had quite a few books she hadn't written yet, and she wanted the movie rights sold to them. And her agent called back saying, I got an offer for the movie rights of one of your books that you haven't written yet for $100,000 or whatever, but I refused it because I think we can get a better deal. Yeah, that was funny. Her interviews are just a treat to watch on YouTube, and she gives many interviews. In fact, she does them more than she writes.
Some people are gifted at that.
Mm. She was a high school dropout, and she never went to college.
Wow.
And yet she remarks now that she's asked to give speeches at college graduation ceremony. And I think that's quite American, I think.
It is, and I mean, admirable, too.
Mm-hmm.
That she built up her career just of her own doing like that.
Yeah.
It's just, I mean, not that other people don't. I'm just saying, like, she had to do a little extra to get herself out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool.
And if you hear creaking, that's my chair. And next was Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra, A Life, one of 2 biographies of Cleopatra that I read this year. I heard of another booktuber, Steve Donahue. Do you watch him?
Mm-mm.
No, he's the other than you, he's the only booktuber I watch regularly. I don't watch any booktube.
That's fair.
He said, if you don't like reading biographies, this is a biography you should read. And I like biographies, so I thought, this will be wonderful. I disliked it.
Oh, no.
I didn't like it. I just didn't. I gave it 3 stars. It was the first one I read, so... But I didn't feel that I learned all that much new. I'll go ahead and just bring up the second one. Cleopatra, the Queen Who Challenged Rome and Conquered Eternity by Angela Alberto.
Or Alberto Angela.
Oh, right, it's the other way around. Alberto Angela, an Italian. And that one, I remember when I first started reading it, I was raving about it to you. Mm-hmm. When we took that trip to the beach and we're walking along, and I said, it's just so well written. It's like a non-fiction novel. And there are some bits that I thought were excellently written, or at least they really did well for me. But when I finished it, I understood why that other person, Steve Donahue, liked Cleopatra, A Life so much. And now that I have 2 reference points, I'd say if I were to recommend a Cleopatra biography to someone, it would be Stacy Schiff's. Alberto Angela's book, as good as it is in parts, it gets a bit needless and salacious and...
Oh, boy.
I don't like this kind of talk, but it gets rather a stereotypically man's writing.
Oh.
And the male gaze and so forth. And if it weren't for those parts, then it would be so much better, and I don't... And this is a new release, and I wonder how he got away with that.
Yes, he
Surely an editor would say, no, you can't write this, certainly not now.
Well, I guess it depends on the publisher.
Mm-hmm. Next is The Devil Wears Prada.
Now, why?
Yeah, this is quite a different tone from everything else I've read. But actually, it isn't a first for me. I didn't add it to Goodreads, unfortunately, yet. But when was this? In early 2020, I read Confessions of a Shopaholic.
What?
Mm-hmm. By... Oh, I can't remember her name. It was my first chick lit book. And I read it because... because I was taking a Spanish class, an economics class, and a mathematics class in winter quarter that year, and I wanted something very light to read that would sort of counterbalance all the austereness. And it served its purpose.
Indeed.
But more so, I really liked that book.
Seriously.
I thought it was really good. It wasn't airheaded or scatterbrained at all. In fact, there were certain... It's about this English woman, and her problem is that she shops too much. She's a shopaholic, to her own financial detriment.
Oh, wow.
I remember many of the complaints in the Goodreads review was that she wasn't relatable. And I don't think that's true. Not that the character needs to be relatable. I think that a reader, ideally, should just sort of accept a new character and try to work with that. But I thought, if anything, she was so relatable that you wouldn't want to read it because it would hit too close to home. Not so much, not that you necessarily spend too much, but she lets things slide. She sort of gives up more and more ground to her...
Addiction?
Yes, that's it, her addiction of spending money on things she likes. Oh, no, that's actually the problem. She doesn't spend money on things she likes, she just spends money.
Wow.
And it's a problem for her. And I think maybe from other people that could be eating or something like that. But yeah, I thought it was just really good. It's sad in some places because her world sort of starts giving way, and she starts getting more and more to the fundamental things of her life. And at some point, she leaves her apartment in Fulham, which apparently, at least at the time this book was written, was quite a trendy area. It's remarked in the book as well. And she goes back to her parents' home in her childhood room. And, it's sort of that last bit of place where she can get some relief and happiness away from her own disasters. But that's when she saves it. I won't say how, of course, but it turns around.
Wow.
It works out more or less. And I thought, that was such a good read. I started reading its sequel, the Shopaholic series. Is a long series. But at that point, I was just taking one English class in summer, and so I needed that counterweight for it, apparently. Now, I don't think that would be the case now. I think I could start reading that and just read it. But yeah, I should start that again.
Yeah.
But going back to The Devil Wears Prada by Lauren Weisberger, this too actually relates to another book in my list. Again, The Chiffon Trenches by Andrea Leontali, because Lauren Weisberger was an assistant to Anna Wintour, and Anna Wintour is Miranda Priestley, the villainess in this book. And Andrea Leontali mentions The Devil Wears Prada at least twice so far.
Wait, is this fiction or non-fiction?
This is fiction. Thinly, though.
Oh,
And,
okay.
Nothing really happens in The Devil Wears Prada. Oddly enough, this was my longest review this year. Of everything I read, I wrote the longest review for The Devil Wears Prada.
Oh.
But nothing really happens. It's description after description, example after example, of Miranda Priestley's draconian orders and her impossible demands, and Andrea's trying to meet those demands. And, it's fine.
Yeah. Very repetitive, huh?
It is, which didn't bother me so much, but I could see how it would bother many people. There's a romantic subplot that goes nowhere. She has an alcoholic best friend. No, a promiscuous best friend who becomes an alcoholic.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you'd be better off reading my Goodreads review, probably. And later on I read The Revenge Wears Prada, the sequel. There are 3 books in the Prada series. The second one has much more of a... I don't know... Well, no, I do know why I wanted to read the first and second books. Just that was to finish the series. The second book definitely has more of a plot. In the second installment, she's left Runway, and she and Emily Charlton, who is Miranda Priestley's assistant when Andrea joins, they start their own magazine called, what was it called? The Big Dip? It's a bridal magazine. And, and she gets married. It doesn't have a very happy ending. If you do read it, I won't say what happens, but it doesn't have a very happy ending, which surprised me.
Oh, man.
But yeah, I mean, it wasn't less than I was expecting, really. It just, yeah, I mean, I just read it, and that was it.
Yeah, I know the feeling, though. Like, sometimes when you're reading a series, you just feel like you gotta finish it.
And next is Utopia by Sir Thomas More. You read this too.
A while ago.
Mm-hmm, and we both gave it 1 star.
Indeed.
I read this because I watched a video essay on YouTube about how one person's utopia can be another person's dystopia. And the example given was More's Utopia. Let's see, I read it, and it's about this guy who meets a friend, and he introduces him to a traveler who talks about his travels to the New World, America in this case, and about a fictional place called Utopia. And my one review of this, my one-line review was, "Welcome to the village, number 6." And I put in parentheses, The Prisoner, 1967. We watched a television series starring Patrick McGoohan about this British agent who resigns and then he's kidnapped and he's taken to the village. And it's a seemingly pleasant place. Everyone has a number. Number 2 is the leader. Number 1 is a sort of Big Brother character. And he tries to escape. And number 2 is trying to get information. Number 2 is a revolving character. He gets replaced with every episode. Sometimes another person comes back. And they want to know why he resigned. And it's a rather surrealist series. I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what this book reminded me of. It's seemingly pleasant. In some cases, it's overtly bad. Let's see, Utopia is a collection of city-states. Each city-state is made up of households. I mean, I can't remember all the details, but one of the terrible things about it is that everyone wears the same outfit. I think that's just awful. Yeah, I mean, he just has some really strange ideas. One of the big things about Utopia that makes it so... And I didn't read about this before I read it. It was that apparent, is that Utopia mimics the life in some religious orders and some monasteries.
Really?
Mm-hmm. It's a rather... there's some Spartan elements. They're just people live simply. But not in really a good way, I'd say. And there are slaves.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the slaves are criminals, some are captured from the surrounding cultures that are all considered everyone's barbaric. Utopia is an extremely nationalistic society.
Wow.
They just about hate everyone who isn't them. But they're so hypocritical, because there's this so-called barbarian tribe that lives outside, just sort of on the outskirts. But they employ the Zapolites, they're called, for combat, to fight the other tribes or civilizations. And they keep stores of gold, and this is important, to pay the other civilizations to war against each other to keep each other weak. So in the case of the Zapolites, they're using what they consider to be the brutal aspects of their culture for their own benefit.
Yeah.
And they couldn't do without that, because they try to avoid combat of their own sort as much as they can. And when they do go into combat, the strangeness continues. More pictures it as such. Firstly, just about everyone has military training. But...
Which they don't use.
Well,
much.
yeah, which they don't use. Or try not to. But when they do, he has the idea that children and wives fight alongside their husbands. But Moore has this idea that everyone fights, and it's just so weird. It's just he doesn't understand how a military should work, and he doesn't understand the first thing about... well, of course, to be fair to him, economics wasn't a science yet, but pearls and gold and all this sort of these valuable things are considered to be child's baubles. These are given to children in Utopia as children's toys. But when the children grow up, they cast off these things, and they focus on the practical things. I was completely turned off of this world. He states that man thinks that because these things are rare, that they must be valuable and good. But on the contrary, nature produces in bounty the things that are needed, and in a minority the things which are not. But doesn't he realize that one pearl could, because it's valuable and not replicable, it could be traded for huge amounts of lumber, and they could represent a larger amount of kind of currency.
Yeah.
And again, the Utopians keep a gold store for everyone else. So they're using the product. And he talks about how foreign countries send their diplomats to Utopia, and the diplomats wear all the fineries that they can put on, the jewels and silk and so forth. And they think that they're impressing the Utopians, but actually, the Utopians see this as childish and silly. Mm-hmm. Well, no, I mean, it's just nonsense. And life in Utopia as Utopian is not all that pleasant. You have to get a permit to travel around the island. And everyone has a very clear role. Everyone has to do work and that sort of thing, and there are, holy days. He doesn't... And this is another weird thing. There's, quite a bit of religious tolerance. He makes this something of a thing of this. That everyone has their own religion, and everyone's religion is respected. And the religious ceremonies are the only places where the restrictions on pearls and gold and valuable resources are lifted, and you can have those in, and the clergy wear very party-colored, feathered things. And it's just, well, why would you make that exception? Where does that come from? There's only the slightest tolerance for atheists, the very minimum. So it isn't that tolerant. People who don't have a faith are considered to be fools, and they should be treated as such. It doesn't sound like a pleasant place to live. And I wonder why he didn't take a stronger stance in favor of Christianity.
Now, when I read it, I couldn't tell if he was being facetious or not. Or satirical, that is.
I think he was serious.
You think he was serious?
Yeah, because the traveler speaks in complete seriousness. Oh. Because he views this as the ideal world. He says, here in the old world we have so much corruption and all this, that, and the other problems doesn't exist in this new world fictional place of Utopia.
There's pros and cons to every system, but
yeah.
This one sounds particularly unpleasant.
Yes. So let's move. Oh, I was hoping we would have a nice book for the next one. The next is The Secret History
by Donna Tartt. I mean, I don't really have a lot to say about it. I've already said on the channel before how I didn't like it. And I just... You know how we're reading Crime and Punishment right now? Mm-hmm. And it has a similar theme about this person who commits a murder, and then the rest of the book sort of talks about motivations and consequences and so on. Mm-hmm. I just feel like Crime and Punishment is what I wanted The Secret History to be. Mm. And I don't know if that was just, false expectations on my part, but, I don't know. Why don't you just say what you liked about it, because I really didn't like much about it.
I enjoyed this immensely.
I know.
That was it.
I know.
And I just liked it. It was just so atmospheric. The
atmosphere?
Mm-hmm.
Without it, do you think you'd still like it? If it just took place in some urban place, I don't know.
Well, maybe Donna Tartt could write an urban environment very nicely, and I'd still like it. But, this was taken directly from her experiences at Bennington College.
Yes.
In fact, I read an article after I read this book about the real-life inspirations for this. No one gets murdered, thankfully, and I was just, I was surprised by how many details were taken from real life.
Really?
Mm-hmm. details.
Now,
again, not murders or anything.
I remember you telling me about that article, and I was thinking afterwards, I'm surprised no one sued her for libel, right?
No, they didn't, but... Well, no, I think isn't that a loophole in that you can slander someone in writing if it's in fiction? Because then
I hope not.
the offended party would have to admit that they are the fictitious person. But actually, Claude Fredericks, who was the classicist in real life who taught Donna Tartt, who is Julian.
The professor.
Yeah. In The Secret History. He didn't talk to Donna Tartt for years after writing this. He didn't like how he was portrayed.
And yet he's like the most nicest character, right? I mean, I thought.
Kind of.
Okay, he's got some flaws.
He has the least amount of blood on his hands.
Exactly. I mean, of all characters, Julian, the professor of Greek, is probably one of the more likable characters. He kind of I compared it with the Dead Poets Society.
Yeah.
It's not directly comparable, but...
I disliked that movie.
Really?
I think I was the only one in my family who disliked it.
See, I like that so much more, but it is a very different story. It really is. Yeah. Even though they both take place at a college.
I think you read the ending. I mean, not you didn't finish this book, but you read about the ending when it happens.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Of course, when I finished it, I wanted so badly to know what happened to Julian.
Oh, right.
I watched this interview where Donna Tartt is in Amsterdam, I think, and she's asked, what happens to Julian? She says, I don't know. Which is so frustrating.
It's truly an author's response, isn't it? Mm-hmm. There's something nice about the ambiguity, even as an author.
And the book is pleasant up to chapter 3.
But that's the thing. It's a long book. And I did like the beginning, fairness. But I just didn't like it. Again, I know you said earlier that the characters don't have to be relatable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like I have to care about a character in order to want to keep reading. And the only character I cared about was the one that got killed.
Bunny, yeah.
And he got killed fairly early.
Mm-hmm. You and I both liked Bunny more so than I think we were supposed to.
I mean, relative to everyone else.
Yeah,
right?
relative.
To me, he was, I feel like she really drew from Lord of the Flies, because Bunny and Piggy share so many similarities, and I couldn't help remarking on that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they both have this kind of goofy nickname, they both are kind of, stocky, and they wear glasses, and everyone finds them a little irritating.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they tend to be the one at the bottom of the pecking order in their group.
Mm-hmm. Did you read the funeral chapter?
Yeah. I think so.
Well, I thought Tartt gave more humanity to Bunny in that.
Yes.
Via his family.
Yeah, I read up to, I got so far, I only had 100, maybe 150 pages left. Not much.
Mm-hmm.
I read most of the book. I didn't want to finish it.
Yeah.
One thing that really bothered me about her writing is how she would just drop little information loads on you instead of building things up. Like with Bunny. First, Bunny was just sort of this irritating guy.
Mm-hmm.
And then as things went on, she started dumping on us that he was racist, homophobic, sexist, all the things. And that just really hurt. Because I didn't believe it, first of all. And secondly, she just dumped that on you.
Yeah, but isn't that how you discover people in real life as well?
I mean, well, what's the chances of somebody being all those things at the same time and just conveniently before they get murdered?
Well, yes, of course, but...
The other thing is, they should have known that about him already. And yet, it feels like we're just discovering it right before he gets murdered.
Well, I think Henry knew it.
Yeah.
Because he
probably
spent more time with Bunny.
Yeah.
Before the events of this book.
Yeah, and there was just some vulgarity in the book I really didn't like either.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, a lot of people liked it, you liked it.
We were reading the book in tenths to do it in 10 weeks. And I really... Every time I finished a 10th, I wanted to keep going, but I
had the opposite feeling. But that's okay, I'm glad we had it as a read-along.
And next is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. You reread that this year, didn't you?
I started to. I didn't end up finishing my reread of it. Even though it's very short, it's a book I felt like I had to take some time with.
Mm-hmm.
I did read... Oh, why didn't I put this on the list? I think because it was part of a collection. But I finally read Chinua Achebe's critique of Heart of Darkness.
Oh, the 1970s one?
I can't remember the year, but...
Oh, okay.
And I wanted to do, talking about the critique, talking about the book.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that'll be a video for this year. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, you didn't like it as much as I did.
Well, I gave it 2 stars. I didn't understand it. I don't think nothing seemed to be registering. I mean, it's the sort of book I should like, I think. It takes place in the past. It's...
With lots of psychology and...
Yes, indeed.
Exposing
Mm-hmm.
the evils and stuff.
Yeah, and about people in faraway places, and how standards start to slip in sort of, there's not as much accountability
Mm-hmm.
as there is when there are more people around, but I don't know, I didn't get it, I didn't think the prose was very good.
That's okay. I mean, I think it's a book people either love or they just really don't. So that's great. At least you gave it a try. I mean, that's one book I do recommend to pretty much everyone, so...
I'll reread it eventually, and perhaps I'll read more about Heart of Darkness to try to understand it more, and then I'll reread it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move on to a slightly more lighthearted topic.
Yeah.
I think.
Sort of.
Oh.
A talented Mr. Ripley. Another Patricia Highsmith, whom I like. Or whose work I like, at least. This is the first book of her Ripley ad. This was written in 56, I think. And I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was real well written. I just really liked the descriptions of Italy and Ripley's adventures with other people. It begins with Tom Ripley. He's in a bar, and he thinks that he's being followed. So he walks out, and he walks down the street, and he turns a few corners and alleys and goes to another bar. And then the same person whom he thinks he is following him shows up again, and he fears that it's a policeman who's after him because he's been forging checks. It turns out that it isn't. It's a man named Mr. Greenleaf. And Mr. Greenleaf has a son, Richard, who's in Italy. And he approaches Tom, saying, I remember you were friends with my son, and I want my son to follow in the family boat-building company. But he's in Italy now, not doing anything, really. And I want you to go to Italy, I'll pay all the expenses, and to convince Richard to come home.
Oh.
And he goes to dinner with the Greenleafs, and he meets Mrs. Greenleaf, and Mr. Greenleaf gives him a watch, and they sort of take him under their wing for at least for as long as they need him.
Yeah.
And he ends up going to Italy. On the way there, there's this... he comes from a rather working class background, but he's very aspirational. Mm-hmm. He's hugely ambitious. He wants... it's a sort of stereotypical thing, like Richard Papin in The Secret History, kind of.
Yeah.
He buys a cap. He's sort of thinking how... with this new cap, I can be whoever I like on this person. I'll be very serious, and the other passengers will think, who's that young man? He doesn't say much. He just sort of sits on the balcony, and then he disappears into his cabin. He must be a very important... He has a lot on his mind or something. And before he leaves, I think one of my favorite things about this book, at least an individual scene, is this beautiful description of a beautiful friendship that Tom Ripley has with a friend of his, Cleo. He visits her apartment. She lives with her parents, and it's just a wonderful 3 or 4 pages.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought it was really great. Let's see. Yes, he goes to Italy. He meets Richard Greenleaf in Mongebello, a fictional coastal Italian town, and he meets Marge, his friend. She likes him, he doesn't like her romantically. And he just begins to endear himself to Richard Greenleaf.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes ahead and tells him, I'm sent here by your father, in a sort of joshing kind of way, because he wants to become Richard's friend. He wants to live in Italy.
Oh.
And he sends letters back to Mr. Greenleaf, reporting on his progress, and Richard Greenleaf sends his father's letter. At some point, beginning in, I think, winter, it starts, it goes over the course of about a year, starting in summer, going to winter and summer again. Mr. Greenleaf writes to Tom that he doesn't see that this is having much fruit, that Richard doesn't seem to be any closer to coming back home than he was before I said to. So he stops sending him money. And sort of the warmth kind of drops. He isn't as chummy as he was.
Yeah.
And so, Tom, though, he's befriended Richard, so it doesn't really matter as much. He's living in Montebello, and he's sort of leeching off Richard's resources. And someone enters into this circle, Freddie, a friend of Richard, or a real friend of Richard's, and, much older. Richard, at the invitation of Freddie, is going to go somewhere else, to Austria, I think. And Tom has to, he has to face something he loathes. The end of this wonderful setup he has.
Oh.
He doesn't want this sort of dreamlike state to end.
Yeah.
So he and Richard take a trip out of Montebello to to Rome and then to France.
Uh-huh.
And on the way back, they stop at a coastal town and they rent a boat and they go out onto the water. And Tom gets the idea to kill Richard Greenleaf and impersonate him.
Oh, well, don't tell me anything more.
Oh, no, okay. Well, there's a wonderful... It's really great. There's a lot of suspense, and there's this
like
twist.
A thriller?
Yes, and it's a thrilling thriller.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And it's a series?
Mm-hmm. Well, this part of Ripley's life ends here, I think, but his life continues. And it's just great. He has to keep up an illusion for Marge, and then to Freddie, but that doesn't work.
Right.
And he has to talk to the police, and he has to be both Greenleaf at some times and Ripley at another time.
So it gets to be more difficult than he probably envisioned.
Yeah.
Or does he feel any guilt about what he did? Like, this was a problem I had with The Secret History. I feel like the characters just get back to their normal lives willy-nilly.
Mm-hmm. He's not a very... guilt isn't a big problem for him.
Okay. Then I probably have a similar issue with this book.
Yeah. And after The Talented Mr. Ripley is another Patricia Highsmith book, Deep Water, which is a domestic thriller. Takes place in Vermont. It's about this couple with a rather strained relationship. I mean, there isn't a whole lot to talk about. You can sort of guess how it goes. Mm-hmm. She's cheating on him, of course, serially. And he tries to frighten them. He's a sort of odd character, the husband. He kind of cares, he kind of doesn't. He has an image. He's constantly thinking about how he's being perceived. It's very slow-moving, but there are a few times where things come to a head and then some action happens. Yeah, it wasn't not my favorite Highsmith so far, but it was good. And lastly is... Oh no, not lastly. The Monster of Florence by Douglas Preston and Mario Spezi. Douglas Preston is a mystery writer, and Mario Spezi is or was an Italian journalist. And this is about Il Mostro, a serial killer in Florence lasting from the 70s to the 80s or 90s. It's just a really interesting, really well-written book. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting look of serial killers as a phenomenon societally, because I think one of the main interests of this case isn't so much the killer, and of course Preston and Spezi put forward their theory as to who that is, but about the corruption and the careerism of people in the police in the Carabinieri. In Italy, there's the police force, but there's the Carabinieri, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a branch of the armed forces that serves as a law-keeping force.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's just so much to it. There's the mafia, there's, of course, the serial killer and rumors, there's mob rule in some ways. There's ties to history, or at least that's what Preston draws.
Mm-hmm.
There's people who are hounded to suicide.
Oh, man.
There's really mad and conspiracy theorist lady who has so much more influence in the police than she had a right to be. Just a terrible, terrible thing in which this one police investigator just followed her word. She sent Preston mad long emails about her ideas about how there's a satanic cult operating in Italy, and it involves the highest members of the judicial system and the aristocracy, and it's just insane, the reaction that some people had to this case.
Wow.
And my last, finally we're getting to the last book. My last finished book of this year was called Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich. The moment I saw this, I was interested, and it is just such an interesting sounding thing. Almost as interesting as the Nazi occult. The beginning of the book goes over the development of narcotics in Germany, and the use of Pervitin, a methamphetamine, in the Wehrmacht, and its use during the initial attack into France that led to Dunkirk and going through the Ardennes and so forth. I think there was this humorous bit where it's talking about Rommel, before he went to the desert and became the Desert Fox. Rommel was part of an army group that was attacking in France, and the nature, or the atmosphere, of the attack was one of great speed, but also sort of chaos, a bit sort of directionless. Once they were through and were around the Maginot Line, it was just sort of attack, with not giving the French any opportunity to regroup. So it was speed that was the key. And Rommel, there are a great many puns in this book, and one of them is calling Rommel the Crystal Fox. He's part of this group that's just attacking various places in France. There's a lot of going over roads, but also cross-country, attacking enemy encampments and that sort of thing. But he was moving so quickly at such great speed that he'd take a town, and he'd report it back, and then he'd move on to another town and take that. And the high command were rather alarmed at how quickly this was going, and they weren't sure if they'd be able to control the situation, for one, but also they weren't too keen on how these relatively lower officers were getting so much success. And so Rommel would be ordered to halt at a certain place, or even go back to an earlier location. But by the time the order reached a town, he was 2 towns away. So he couldn't keep up with his orders. Or no, his orders couldn't keep up with him. A bulk of this book concerns a man named Dr. Theodore Morell.
Wait, so with Rommel, did you tell me that drugs played a role in that speed, or am I just...
Oh, yes. Yes, the Pervitin.
Oh.
These were pills that were distributed in the millions and millions to the Wehrmacht, and surprisingly because we think of the Reich as being a very regimented, very rules-based society, but there were not even any guidelines about how you should consume Pervitin. It was up to whatever the commanding officer felt was best, maybe on advice from his physician or the surgeon for the group, or even down to the individual's discretion.
Wow.
And, of course, it gave you a bit of pep, but then you had to pay for that later. So a soldier could go on fighting for 2 or 3 days without sleeping, but then he'd have to stop.
Wow.
And then, yeah, that would be a rather vulnerable state. You'd have to have a backup for that. But later on, Norman Ohler, the author, writes about a man named Dr. Theodore Morell, who's something of a real doctor, something of a quack. He gets his first boost in his career as a society doctor. He specializes in giving people injections that solve their short-term problems.
Oh.
And of course he's just giving them drugs. He gives them an injection, and then they have this boost of mood and energy, and they rave about him, and he gets more clients and so forth. And his first client in the Nazi hierarchy is Heinrich Hoffmann, the Reich photographer. And he's obviously a very busy person. He has to attend many social functions and public events and keep up with all the leadership, and he's having trouble with this, so he visits Dr. Morell. Morell gives him an injection, and then he gives him high reviews to the leadership and to Hitler personally. And Hitler realizes that he could use some of this. So he engages Morell, and in short, Morell becomes his personal physician. A key thing about Morell is that he isn't in the armed forces, and this was important to the Fuhrer, because he wanted someone who wasn't corruptible by others. He wanted a doctor who was all his. Morell actually wanted to become more of an establishment person. He petitioned to have a position for himself in the Wehrmacht, but this was rejected. And he designed himself his own uniform.
Of course he did.
Yes, to the irritation of others who had real uniforms. And, of course, he gave Hitler his pick-me-ups, but Hitler wanted more and more, and he didn't want to have to pay the expense of these boosts of mood and energy by having to sleep later, of course. So Hitler would have this event coming up where he'd have to give an inspiring speech or meet Mussolini or something, and he'd ask him for an injection from Morell, who at this point was so busy looking after Hitler that he didn't have time for his family anymore. And he wrote letters to his wife rather regretfully. And so for this event, he'd have this incredible energy, and he'd give all this inspiration to everyone. But of course, over time, the cost of it started racking up. The injection holes in his arm weren't healing in time for the next injection. So he got something called tire tracks on his arms. But of course, he just didn't bother Hitler. He just wanted more and more injections. And of course, his body started becoming desensitized to the effects, so he had to get more and more. In the meantime, Morell was making something of a mint for himself. He produced these things called, I think, Vitamolten. It wasn't anything special, it was just a vitamin compound. But he'd give Hitler some in a little gold box, and then little silver boxes to the rest of the hierarchy. And they all gave it raving reviews, whatever the effect or lack of effect that it had. And so he sold these, they were distributed to the SS and the Wehrmacht and so forth. And he became richer and richer. At some point, of course, other more qualified doctors in the party in Wehrmacht and SS, namely Karl Brandt, who was a surgeon, and a man named Giesing, I think, they were very dissatisfied with what was going on. They saw that the hierarchy was becoming addicted to drugs, and they didn't like this at all, of course, especially of the Fuhrer, and they in fact suspected that maybe Morell was a foreign agent who was hired to poison, and even perhaps kill the Fuhrer. And so, with the support of Himmler, the leader of the SS, and Hitler's number 2, they confronted Theo Morell, and just accused him, and just sort of attacked him, like a kind of trial, not that formal, of course. But Hitler stood by his personal physician, and rebuked these two doctors. And Himmler, sensing that this just wasn't going to work, switched sides, and I have some highlights from the book of this. Brandt says to him, trying to intimidate Morell and put him in his place, "Do you think anyone would believe you if you claimed that you didn't issue this prescription?" He's talking about Eucadol, another drug that Morell was giving to Hitler. "Do you think Himmler might treat you differently from anyone else? So many people are being executed at present that the matter would be dealt with quite coldly." And later on, Himmler, I believe, makes his own comment. The Reichsfuhrer SS called the physician into his office and coldly informed him that he had himself sent so many people to the gallows that he no longer cared about one more. But, as I said, Hitler stood by Dr. Morell, and this effort fell apart. And in fact, Karl Brandt and Giesing, they were, along with Albert Speer even, were rather began to sort of lose stock with Hitler in favor of Morell. So it was a failure. And Morell just continued to progress. And as the Germans were advancing in the east, they became in control of areas that processed the animal carcasses, the sort of meat processing factories. And Morell had this fantastic idea of having, quote, an organotherapeutic factory. He wanted to take the remains of these animals, not the meat and the things that were being used, but what's the list here? Thyroid glands, adrenal glands, testicles, prostates, ovaries, Cowper's glands, etc., etc., and make these these injections that.
Oh no! Say it ain't so.
No. And of course he sort of spoke on behalf of Hitler in this. I mean, whether it was true or not, he used his position to take Wehrmacht resources to his personal benefit. There's this, I mean, it's really surprising what he was able to do. From the book, to transport masses of raw animal materials there to other factories in more towards the west, because the east started crumbling a bit. A journey of over 600 miles, and thus to make as much profit as possible out of the Ukraine, he moved heaven and earth, or rather the whole state apparatus. It was quite natural for the Führer's personal physician, as his letterheads had it, to reinforce his own wishes by claiming Hitler's full agreement. In a phase of the war that was taut, T-A-U-T, stretched, to the breaking point, when there were only a few hotly disputed communication routes to the east, which were urgently needed for bringing supplies to the troops as well as returning wounded soldiers, Morell blithely used the logistics of the Führer's headquarters to send hundreds of trucks and Reichsbahn wagons countless miles across Eastern Europe to shift his plundered tons of pig stomachs, pancreatic and pituitary glands, spinal cords, and cows and pigs and sheep's livers. The strict instruction to everyone that the Führer's headquarters to prevent any non-crucial vehicle use plainly didn't apply to him.
I was saying earlier, this would make such a funny movie.
What? Have you heard of The Death of Stalin?
I have, yes.
It's a terribly vulgar movie, but I've seen clips of it, and it's hilarious.
Really?
It is absolutely, it's a dark comedy, but it's done, it doesn't sound on paper like it would work, but it's so helplessly funny to watch.
Wow.
It's rather dark as it is. What were you saying?
Oh, but this Morell guy was quite a character.
Oh yeah, I could easily envision a kind of Death of Stalin-like movie of this. I haven't seen that movie, though. That would be about drugs in the Nazi hierarchy, because he started issuing injections to the other leaders, because they had to keep up with Hitler, of course. Man. It's a very sad story, in the midst of all the terrible things that were going on.
Yeah, I mean, just very messed up. I mean, like so many things out of Nazi Germany.
And Morell, this is very much as much a story of Morell as anyone else. He, of course, the tide of the war turned against Germany, and they had to retreat back to the Führer bunker in Berlin. And Morell eventually, because the author very much treats Morell as a supplier and Hitler as a drug addict. And Morell just eventually couldn't give product anymore. And he just fell out of Hitler's circle. And the ending of his life is very sad. Of course, now that doesn't mean that we should sympathize with Morell, who was very much a bad character and very unscrupulous. Not only cooperating and working for the Nazis, but also being corrupt within the Nazis for his own benefit, so there are two layers of evil there. But, let's see, he was interrogated by the Allies, but he was in a very sort of traumatized and reduced state. He was an older man at this point, and he gave a story, but he couldn't keep his story straight, and he was just sort of speaking gibberish at some point, and they just discounted his testimony.
Huh.
He was no longer of any use. And I believe in this book the ending has it that he was standing at a train station and some half-Jewish nurse took pity on him and took him to a hospital where he died 2 years later or something.
Wow.
I mean, there's just no goodness in any of this story.
Yeah. So, but he wasn't a spy, clearly. Like, he was just a very corrupt figure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you read some really interesting books this year. What were, like, did you have any top favorites, or?
Oh, well, I think probably Blitzed and The Monster of Florence and the Talented Mr. Ripley, and of course Howard's End.
Mm-hmm.
The Secret History I enjoyed. The Cleopatra biographies were a bit disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah, just mixtures.
Well, cool. I mean, this was great. I was just saying to you on our break how we should do this more often.
I'm very flattered.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you read so many different genres and topics. It's just so interesting to hear you talk about them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for sharing your reading, and we will be doing more of these in the future.
Thank you for having me, Marion.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for listening.